Today we're going to concentrate on the first session on regulating the arms trade. Follow the same format as yesterday's sessions with 4 speakers, then Q&A session. I'm very keen to give as many people as possible a chance to question the speakers, so I'm going to be pretty ruthless with their time on their actual formal presentations, and then give more time for the Q&A. Can we have the first slide up, please? Good morning. My name is Tim Ripley. I'm a British journalist. I specialise in the defence industry, the arms trade, as some people call it. And I also am a historian of the defence industry. And to kick off this session, I think it would be quite useful to give you a bit of a vignette about the arms trade and some of the reasons why we have moved into a regime of trying to control it. Now, I've put 2 pictures up on the screen of 2 characters who are very famous in the history of arms control in this sector. We're going to concentrate, of course, this morning on conventional weapons, focusing on small arms and light weapons, which are notorious for their involvement in small wars, squalid internal conflicts. Now, on the left-hand side, you've got a picture of perhaps the most famous merchant of death. Here's the man who the name was coined for. He is a gentleman called, or he was born as Vasily Zacharias in Turkey, which was part of the Ottoman Empire in 1849. But he soon became famous as his international name, Basil Zaharov. He was knighted by the British Empire for his services to the British Empire, to the British state at that time. And he became infamous during World War I because it turned out that he had supplied arms to every side in the war, from the Germans, the Ottomans, the Austrians, the Russians, the British, the French, the Italians, various Balkan countries. In 1917, the Soviet Bolshevik Revolution took over, and they exposed the archives of the Tsarist regime, which exposed lots of Zaharov's correspondence with his various customers. And he became notorious for unscrupulous behavior, for bribing officials, for seducing government ministers' wives to gain inside track on their arms deals. And he became a figure of great notoriety in the immediate aftermath of World War I. There was even a US Senate inquiry into his behavior as the man who caused the start of World War I, which of course led to millions of deaths. And his behavior, the controversy surrounding him led to lots of countries introducing their own legal restrictions on the arms trade, many of which are still in existence today. And you fast forward to the character on the right, a gentleman called Victor Bout, who was immortalized in a movie called The Lords of War. Now, he's now residing as a guest of the US government in the federal penitentiary in Illinois. He epitomized the post-Soviet arms trade. He was a former officer in the Soviet army, born in Tajikistan, but when the Soviet Union collapsed, like many former Soviet military intelligence figures, he looked to how he could get rich, and he became notorious for having his private airline of former Soviet aircraft and an army of former Soviet intelligence agents who went around the world finding wars to sell off the former Soviet Union's arms stockpile. And in the famous wars of the 1990s and the early 2000s in Africa, Asia, South America, East Asia, he was at the center of all the incidents. And eventually, the long arm of the US government caught up with him in Thailand. He was arrested, put on trial, and sentenced to 25 years in jail in the United States. His final crimes involved supplying the FARC rebels in Colombia and various drug cartels in Colombia. But those 2 characters are the sort of the public face of the arms trade. They are the merchants of death personified. They are considered utterly immoral, have no loyalties to any country, and play fast or loose with legal niceties. But their characters, their careers, their notoriety, really get to the heart of why countries and organizations try and control this sphere. And as a result of the publicity around their activities, we have many of these rules that are in place today. Now, these rules-based activities to try and control the arms trade, they fall into three main sort of areas. Yesterday we had, of course, our gentleman from the US Department of State talking about normative behaviors. And this is a big part of regulating this area of the arms trade. The political, civil society, media outrage at some of the activities of these types of gentlemen, these types of people, is a big part in regulating the arms trade. The transparency that is brought to bear on some of these people is a big part in stoking and helping to control the arms trade. Now then you have national legal restrictions. Again, many of them dating from the time of Zaharev, and the controls on how states control their own arms industry. The famous end-user certificate came about after Zaharev sold arms to both sides, every side in World War I, and countries wanted to have a control of where their arms trade, arms industry sold their products to. And then we have, overlaying that, international controls. You have regional groups like the EU, the ECOWAS in West Africa, and then you have the United Nations with their overarching arms trade treaty. And in the sessions today, we're going to look at all that kind of thing. First of all, we're going to have a gentleman from Nigeria. Forgive me my pronunciation, but I'm going to give it a go. We have, forgive me, here we go, Aboye Nicholas Adeomi. Is that right? Good. Okay, right. And he is focusing on the ECOWAS activities to try and control the arms trade in West Africa, which of course was the stamping ground of Victor Boat. Can we take the slide off, please? Thank you. Good. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'll start by pronouncing the name correctly. I am Adeomi Abayomi Nicholas. I would like to start by conveying the greetings of the leadership of the ECOWAS Commission to the organizers of this conference, and to also express our appreciation for being invited to be part of this conference. And then on a personal note, I really am humbled to be among these distinguished panelists, among the esteemed participants. This morning I will be sharing with you some perspectives on the regulation of conventional arms. But I was speaking more specifically on the experience or the practice in ECOWAS member states or the ECOWAS community, because we have a novelty, a practice that we think that if this is, if other RECs or other regional bodies could carry this on board, that will go a long way, or that may contribute a lot to their effort to control conventional arms trade in their respective region. Well, I would not want to bother you a lot. I know you are already aware. I'd like to say the background by what are really the factors that really facilitate arms proliferation. I would like to point to two key factors, and particularly referring into the experience in West Africa. West Africa has a teeming youth population where majority of them are unemployed. So the population become already used to in the hands of criminal gangs, terrorists, and the likes, and political parties. One of the trends we find in ECOWAS member states are the weaponization of election or electoral process. Political parties are quite, election in West Africa is not like in other states. It's quite a very tug of war. It's always almost war. So we have these already tools, the youths who are mostly unemployed and who have become readily employed or utilized by these political parties. So they become a tool in the hand of political parties. Another factor which has contributed to the proliferation of arms in the region is weak institutions. We have national agencies, we have security forces, we have bodies that are responsible for arms control, but whose capacity, operational and institutional-wise, are not really well beefed up. To the reasons cartels of arms trade have been able to penetrate their ranks, and this has yielded or led to proliferation of arms in the region. Further, I would like to also give us a background as well, some of the impacts of arms proliferation generally, and I'm talking about West Africa again as a specific focus. Black cases whereby arms proliferation led to case of violation of human rights. We have reducing harm crime, harm gangs, militancy, political thuggery, ethnic violence, terrorism, and armed conflict. Where it's no more news, the havoc that Boko Haram and the likes of the terrorist group are wreaking in West Africa. These are some of the impact of arms proliferation. And then we've also seen cases of child soldiers as well. These are some of the effect on conflict dynamics of conflict dynamics that arms proliferation has fostered in the region. And this has also caused the destabilization of the entire fabric of peace and security of the state. In a number of states, the resources that ought to be utilized for development are being channeled towards fighting terrorism or fighting armed gangs. These are led to little resources available for development. Talking now specifically on what are the measures that ECOWAS as a state or ECOWAS as a community has put in place. This is enshrined in the ECOWAS Convention on Small and Light Weapons. This is an instrument that contains practical measures and provisions to control arms regulation. And the novelty of this instrument is the what we call the ECOWAS exemption on arms transfer. In the ECOWAS region as a whole, it is prohibited for any state to import arms and ammunition into the territory. However, the convention, which is the legal instrument in place, gave room for states only to acquire or procure arms for 3 legitimate reasons. So the reasons namely are one, defense and security of the state, internal security, or to participate in peacekeeping operation. So on these 2 reasons, states are allowed to import arms upon procuring these permission from the ECOWAS Commission, where we work and where we regulate arms transfer into the region. So this has been working a lot, and then, however, we found out that some elements made some effort to bridge or to penetrate into this arms regulation measures, and then we have also found out that some states, especially states that are outside of the Western arrangement, are not respecting this ECOWAS certificate of exemption, which require every state to acquire, which a state must acquire before the import arms. Now, having said that, what are the measures that is working in place in ECOWAS and which we think can be used to mitigate trends of arms trafficking? Number one, as we all know, most of the arms that end up in illicit markets start at one point in the life cycle as illegal exports from the exporting state to the importing states. However, along the line, due to some challenges in the stockpile management and security of member states, some of these arms have found themselves into the wrong hands. So we believe, as part of the measures that can be utilized to mitigate trends in illicit arms transfer, I think, in my view, the first point would be for states to develop national, operational, and institutional capacity, particularly starting with legal frameworks. Many of the legal frameworks that we have in place in some of the countries in Africa are really out of date. Some dated back to 1950, and then these instruments are unable to contend or to confront emerging contemporary challenges of arms transfer. Second point, I think, is also important for states to work on the national stockpiles, the physical security and the management of their national stockpiles. And then also it's important to work on police and custom controls. The nature of most of states in Africa, or most borders in Africa, the borders are so contiguous, make them porous. So criminal elements have been able to penetrate these borders, perpetrating arms transfer or illegal arms transfer. I think another important element is also marking and tracing. And ECOWAS, as present, we have in place a marking exercise that's ongoing, and the mandate has been given to the member states to ensure that all the arms are marked according to ECOWAS code. So now it's possible for us, when we pick up an illicit harm in any member state in ECOWAS, to find out, to know from which country the harm has originated. So marking and tracing is also a key element that could be used to also regulate arms transfer. Now, I would like to talk briefly also on the gaps that were found in existing international regulation of arms trade. Number one, many of the international legal framework on arms control have not been ready to really address the weaponization of robotics. Now, yesterday we talked about new technologies emerging in arms development. And so many of the legal frameworks are weak in this regard. Also, many of the international legal framework do not really carefully take care of the dual use goods, and they're also broken as well. Broken has been the gaps in broken has been one of the factors that has really facilitated illicit arms transfer. And then this talks not only about the ECOWAS region, but as a whole. If you pick up any legal instrument talking about arms transfer or regulating arms transfer, you find out that existing international arms control system is not adequately combating illicit brokering. Lastly, I would like to talk about the recently new instrument that has been put in place globally to regulate arms transfer, the Arms Trade Treaty, and how can we facilitate the implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty. And I would like to tailor this specifically to the ECOWAS as a block. Before the Arms Treaty came into place, there was the existing ECOWAS Convention on Small Arms and Light Weapons, which I already mentioned. I think the first thing to really to put in place to ensure, because if you look at the, there's need for an institutional framework that will lead the implementation of ATT. And then we'll find out that in ECOWAS already before the ATT came to force, we have our National Convention on Small Arms and Light Weapons. So it is in this light that it's very important that the National Small Arms and Light Weapons mandate are expanded to cover other conventional weapons, that outside of small arms and light weapons. It's also very important that to criminalize illicit trafficking as a serious crime. This is not really as it's strong in the ATT, but however, in many of the regional instruments, especially the ECOWAS Convention, this is quite explicitly expressed. In a nutshell, to round up my talk this morning, there are a number of areas of talking about how can we facilitate the implementation of ATT, which is an instrument that is being put in place to regulate arms transfer. There are a number of interplays as well as differences between ATT and other instruments on arms control, such as the ECOWAS Convention on Small Arms and Light Weapons. Some understanding and the widening support for certain issues, such as import control, have advanced since the coming to force of the ECOWAS Convention on Small Arms and Light Weapons. Other issues are less extensively covered in ATT, for example, enforcement measures. In this regard, the different measures, different instruments are important in their potential to complement each other and become building blocks in the operating control regime anticipated by the ATT. In a nutshell, it's very important that the ATT or member states who seek to implement ATT put in place a framework that will combine or that will facilitate the simultaneous implementation of ATT and the already existing illegal instrument on arms control in the regions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, that's very well placed to move us on to our next speaker, who's going to focus specifically on the ATT, the Arms Trade Treaty. And forgive me another mangling of one of our speakers' names. Forgive me. Jānis, Kārkliņš. Am I there or not? Okay.
More or less.
All right. Okay. Off you go.
Thank you, sir. I have to confess that I never thought that I would be ever speaking about arms trade on Saturday morning at 9 a.m. But even less that somebody would listen to me doing that. But on a more serious note, I will try to, in 1,000 words, address the three of the guiding questions, namely 4, 5, and 6. starting with what are the shortcomings in existing international regulation of arms trade. So I would say that for many years the international trade in conventional arms was rather poorly regulated. Unregulated and irresponsible arms trade intensify and prolong conflicts, that's obvious, lead to regional instability, facilitate human rights abuse on a large scale, and undermine social and economic development. The lack of effective regulation led to concerted international efforts that, when global interest in an arms trade treaty began to develop in early 2000s. The existence of a global treaty means the global standard that was established. That the very fact that so many governments have now either established a national control list or amended or improved existing legislation is a step in the right direction towards reducing the harm caused by uncontrolled arms trade. As you know, the object and purpose of the ATT is to create the highest possible international standard for the trade in arms. It also emphasizes the importance of preventing and eradicating the illegal trade in weapons. The ATT strengthens international law. As a comprehensive and global treaty, it brings stability and greater predictability to the arms trade. If the ATT is effectively implemented, therefore, diversion will be greatly reduced. This is first because ATT requires governments to explicitly authorize or deny transfers in or out of their countries. Having effective national control systems in place throughout the world will be a big step towards reducing diversion, and it is one of the successes of the treaty that this is increasingly happening throughout all regions. States must introduce legislation and establish comprehensive control systems to be able to conduct case-by-case risk assessment. Exporters have to consider the end use and the end user of weapon shipments when reviewing applications for arms transfer licenses and making risk assessment. Second, there is the requirement that governments assess the risks and violation of international human rights and humanitarian law before they say yes or no to an arms transfer. Where the risk is overriding, they should deny the transfer. Third, Article 11 on diversion, which specifically requires governments to address the risks of diversion. In addition to be required to take steps to prevent any diversion of weapons, governments are encouraged to share data and other information that can help. Other aspects previously unconsidered have achieved greater attention under the ATT. Latvia's presidency, which was last year, focused on gender and gender-based violence, which enabled a more detailed exploration of this aspect. As most of you know, the ATT is the first treaty that makes links between arms control and gender-based violence and gives governments another tool to try to stop gender-based violence by limiting weapon sales where they could be used for this abuse. At the 5th Conference of States Parties adopted an action plan that recognized the gender impact on arms violence and conflict and encouraged to collect gender disaggregated data on victims and to make this data publicly available. States will also share information on how they apply the gender-based violence risk assessment criteria in the treaty, develop a training guide for export control officials, and discuss how they are interpreting and using language in the treaty related to GBV. Governments have also committed to strive for gender equality in their delegations at all levels of seniority. Now about the ATT implementation assessment. So the strength and at the same time the weakness of ATT is that it relies on national implementation. This can be a weakness because there wasn't established a system of international enforcement, monitoring and verification. there are ambiguities within the treaty language which led to different interpretations of the treaty across governments. While the ATT specifies that governments should do, for example, creating a national control list, conducting thorough risk analysis, maintaining records, it does not specify how they should do it. This means that states in practice have developed different approaches. At the same time, the strength of this, however, is that there is more buy-in from governments because it is owned at the national level. ATT community is growing. Currently 105 states parties and 33 signatories. 70% of member states, UN member states, have joined the treaty. So though there are 56 countries that haven't. This means that there is a large network of cooperation, information sharing, and knowledge building. There are often similar challenges and experiences at the national level, so information sharing between regional blocs can be particularly helpful. Article 15 is focused on specifically international cooperation and encourages states to share information and consult each other on matters of mutual interest. I also have to admit that there is an important role the civil society play in monitoring of implementation. Control Arms ATT Monitor is an annual publication produced by civil society which assesses treaty implementation alongside looking at specific themes each year. And now let me very briefly touch upon how other instruments can establish to enhance arms export control. It could be argued that it is better to harmonize and strengthen existing arms control regimes at this point rather than seeking to create new instruments. Instead, it is perhaps useful to think about areas that are important for effective implementation. So, first of all, importance of political will. Secondly, assistance. And thirdly, transparency in anti-corruption legislation can be very complementary in enhancing the effectiveness of arms control mechanisms. Capacity issues. States have very different levels of resourcing and technical capacity when it comes to arms control. Also the importance of tracking and tracing. So database such as Interpol, iArms, and NGO conflict armament research, iTrace, both funded by the European Union, are good resources. With this, Chairman, I have concluded my remarks.
Thank you very much. And we now go to our third speaker, who's going to concentrate on Latin America. From Canada, we have Mélanie Régimbal. Régimbal, thank you. Right, off you go.
Thank you. If I think I can be heard from here. Good morning, everyone, and again, thank you to the organizers for including Latin America and the Caribbean on the agenda. Although I am Canadian, I'm here in representation of the United Nations Regional Center for Peace, Disarmament, and Development in Latin America and the Caribbean. And for those who do not know, UNLIREC, which is how we are known, forms part of the Office for Disarmament Affairs. We are one of the 3 regional centers that operates in the region. I will concentrate my comments today on the arms trade in the region and providing perspectives on how it is being implemented in Latin America and the Caribbean, but we'll focus exclusively on the small arms component of the arms trade treaty, because in Latin America and the Caribbean, the small arms epidemic and the homicides and the illicit trade and the armed violence that comes attached with it is really the #1 concern for Latin American and the Caribbean states. And as a matter of fact, the Latin American and Caribbean states were at the forefront of the arms trade treaty negotiations because they understood that the arms trade treaty could be a tool that could be used as a top-down approach to try to address issues related to illicit trafficking, crimes, armed violence, and it could become one of the many tools that they have in their basket of international instruments to try to address the issue. And when I say that small arms and light weapons, but small arms in particular, whether it's parts, components, ammunition, or the firearms themselves, is a real cause of concern. Just to put some perspectives on the table, Latin America has, and the Caribbean have, the unfortunate reputation of being the number one as far as gun violence in the world. It is the region with no conflict and with the highest homicide rates by firearms in the region. More than 75% of the homicides are committed with firearms, and the average rate across the 33 states of the region is at 17.4 homicides per 100,000. The Pan American Health Organization, or the World Health Organization, considers any level of 10 per 100,000 as epidemic level when it comes to deaths. So when you're looking at 17 as an average for the 33 regions, the 33 countries of the region, we are looking at an epidemic rate of deaths per firearm in the region. So this is why the Arms Trade Treaty was perceived as one of the tools to be looked at as a complementary one to the efforts that were already in place, whether it's under the international instruments such as the Program of Action or the Firearms Protocol, or even the regional instruments such as the CIFTA Convention, which is the Inter-American Convention on curbing illicit trafficking of small arms. The dichotomy that is very interested in Latin America and the Caribbean is, albeit we have the highest homicide rates in the region and that gun violence is extremely prominent, the majority of our states are not actual producers of small arms or ammunition, but rather importers of this, whether it is legal or illegal import. The guns are circulating in high quantities in the region. With the exception of 2 or 3 countries, mainly in South America, who are prominent producers, the reality is that most of the weapons that enter into circulation are coming from illicit sources. One of the reasons for this is that firearms are used as the vehicles to facilitate all sorts of other illicit trafficking and criminal activities, such as the drugs and human trafficking, among others. In the region, states until before the ATT focused really on trying to curb illicit trafficking and to address the high rates of armed violence from a bottom-up approach, looking at operational interceptions, investigations, and trying to find resources and abilities to address this from really a law enforcement point of view at the national level, but really from a very practical point of view. So when the Arms Trade Treaty came into force, for the states, it was an opportunity to look at control measures from a national point of view, but to look at the structure so that both the bottom up of the law enforcement, first responders, could also find its way to a middle ground where enforcement could be taken up in a holistic manner. So in the first 2 years of implementation, focus was really on establishing control authorities and establishing legislation that deals with arms control and looking at import and export. Of course, for Latin America, diversion is one of the key issues that is being looked at, and there are several good practices that have been put in place. The Central American states have focused on looking at tracing as one of the issues, and by putting in place also control lists so that it would facilitate import and export mechanisms for its authorities. Legislation is something that is, of course, very important for the Latin American and Caribbean states, but in general, the legislation that is in place is fully comprehensive, but what we have is difficulties in the implementation. So because I only have 1 minute left, I would simply try to finish up saying that one of the issues that we really must focus on in the region is to continue supporting states in strengthening their control bodies and their import-export control authorities so that they can focus on implementation of the legislations that are already in place. The structures are there. We just need to be able to strengthen that top shear so that we can help them as an international community bridge the gap between the operational level and the top heavy control authorities. And I will leave it at that for the time being.
Thank you very much. And our final speaker comes from Italy, Sigrid Lipott, who is going to give us a view from the NGO side of this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers. And so I'm extremely honored and happy to attend and present at this conference for the first time. I work at a small arms survey where I coordinate a project on strengthening the implementation and enforcement of the UN arms embargo on DPRK. And today I would like to give a very short introduction on the project, underline especially how it fits into the broader framework of conventional arms trade control efforts. And in doing so, I will also attempt to answer some of the more general guiding questions that were kindly provided. So first of all, for those of you who do not know the survey, as we recently joined a network, we are located in this shiny building at Maison de la Paix in Geneva as a part of the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies. And we currently have a team of more than 25 researchers and project managers. And we're specialized into 3 thematic areas, which are stocks and flows of arms and ammunition, impact of illicit arms and armed violence, and measures and programs that promote security. Here are some examples of work that has been undertaken throughout the years. And among other things, we provide support for multilateral arms control processes, as well as support to regional organizations. Recently, for example, to the LAS and the SADC, and also to individual countries on international arms control instruments implementation. So just to recall, these core small arms control instruments are in chronological order. The Firearms Protocol, which was the first legally binding global instrument on small arms, adopted by UN member state 2001, and which then formed a separate process focusing on transnational law enforcement challenges. Then in the same year, we had the UN Program of Action. And then in 2006, the International Tracing Instrument, that focuses on a specific set of countermeasures, such as marking, tracing, and record keeping. And finally, the final component in the suite of principal global instrument governing small arms, which is the Arms Trade Treaty, adopted in 2013, establishing legally binding commitments governing the trade in conventional arms, including small arms and light weapons. So I would argue that as some of these instruments are based upon voluntary engagement, this is actually the first shortcoming of existing international regulation in conventional arms, including small arms and light weapons. As when the ATT entered into force in 2014, there were actually more international laws in the world regulating, for example, the trade in bananas and many other commodities than arms trade. For many years, the civil society has actually recognized this deficiency and called for global action. And finally, the ATT has put an end to this important gap in international law. However, it is still to be considered a treaty in its infancy, let's say. And it's also really difficult to tell to what extent the treaty itself has had an impact yet. because when states do not authorize arms transfers, they do not usually give a reason for doing so. But I would also like to highlight other UN processes that may be considered as part of existing international regulation, in particular arms embargoes. These are usually not regarded as arms control instruments per se, but considering that small arms are often the weapons of primary concern in embargo zone, actually the link between UN arms embargoes and UN small arms process is very strong. For example, the Program of Action calls on states to ensure effective implementation of UN arms embargoes. And also the Security Council, when it adopted its first thematic resolution on small arms in 2013, Resolution 2117, it called, among other things, for full compliance with arms embargoes. And a link can be obviously also found in the Arms Trade Treaty, in Article 6, Paragraph 1, that prohibits any transfer that would violate a state party's obligation to comply with measures adopted by the Security Council under Chapter 7 of the Charter of the UN, in particular arms embargoes. So at the first sight, this merely reiterates an existing obligation, but it actually has potential to create a more uniform approach to the implementation and monitoring of UN arms embargoes. And in fact, I would also argue that bringing UN arms embargoes and Chapter 7 measures more generally within the purview of the ATT also subjects state parties to a broader regulatory framework of the ATT itself, including requirement, for example, to designate competent national authorities and to have an effective and transparent national control system to regulate the transfer of conventional arms and related items, as per Article 5, and which are also two of the basic requirements, I would argue, of an effective national sanctions implementation mechanism. And to this regard, also excessive narrowness of the scope of the ATT could be considered as another shortcoming of existing international legislation. At first instance, surveillance equipment and military technology, as well as grenades and landmines, for example, generally remain outside the treaty. And also the regulation of trade in ammunition and components remains largely incomplete. And also Security Council arms embargoes apply to a much broader range of weapons and activities than those included within the scope of the ATT itself. For arms embargoes generally prohibit the direct or indirect supply, sale, or transfer of arms and related material of all type, to include also the paramilitary equipment, for example, as well as technical assistance, which is increasingly problematic in some of the regions, and training and financial or other assistance related to military activities. Nevertheless, it is not international law, the level at which an effective treaty will have its greatest impact, obviously, and what matters is the most is how its provisions are translated into domestic policy. Therefore, to assess how states parties implement specific articles, we should be looking not so much at national transfer or export decisions, but rather at domestic legislation, regulation, and policies as a basis for arms transfer assessments and decisions. And to this regard, many national arms control systems do not explicitly include Chapter 7 obligations, meaning that there is often an absence of compatible legislation to enforce and implement an arms embargo. And that's actually one of the loopholes that needs to be addressed at the national implementation level. So it is within this framework that we have developed a strengthening implementation and enforcement of UN arms embargo on DPRK project. And since I don't have so much time left, I will just give a very short overview of this. So the project is intended to strengthen national implementation and enforcement of the United Nations arms embargo on DPRK, and in doing so, it aims to contribute to the efforts of the Security Council Sanctions Committee and its panel of experts established in 2006 and 2009, respectively, to curb the proliferation of arms and also other illicit items from the country. But we focus mainly on small arms and light weapons. As the survey is engaged in policy-relevant research, we have found out that in some cases, UN member states in Africa and the Middle East, as well as Asia, have limited awareness or capacities to implement UN sanctions and the arms embargo on conventional arms, in particular on DPRK. As a matter of fact, DPRK is, as you all may know, is currently under a total UN arms embargo that prohibits two-way trade in conventional arms. That is both imports and exports from the country. And also the arms embargo has been expanded several times to only recently include prohibition on both the import and export of small arms and light weapons. And while we recognize that a prohibition on arms-related transfer to DPRK and from DPRK come at least conceptually as secondary measures, as the actual purpose of the sanction regime on DPRK is to prevent resources getting into the WND program. Small arms and light weapons exports by DPRK should not be estimated. As a matter of fact, the small arms survey estimates that total SOV exports are worth at least 100 million annually, even though South Korean sources report that could be even up to 300 million. And also latest, a panel of experts reports have clearly indicated that selling small arms has become one of the country's most profitable revenue sources. And I would also like to highlight that illicit arms trafficking in small arms and light weapons, but also more in general by DPRK, extends well beyond weapons and ammunition, and has recently incorporated a provision of security assistance, including military and paramilitary training, military intelligence construction services, and others such as technical data and equipment for producing arms and ammunition. We are conducting trend analysis, and we have identified up to 16 countries in Africa, and 4 in the narrow Middle East region, and 8 in Asia, which are or have been listed as sanctions violators or facing violation probes for non-compliance with the arms embargo. So there is a lot more to say, especially about national reporting. That is a key area in not just in UN arms embargoes implementation, but more in general in arms control instruments implementation. But since my time is over, as I understand, I'll turn it over to the chair, and in case give you more details.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we're going to explore many of these issues in the Q&A session.